everyone, I'm Jess Thompson, Content Manager for Learning and Development at ATD. Welcome back to the Ask a Trainer series. On today's episode, my guest Megan Dillon and I are talking about how to transform your training through effective practice. So stay tuned. Hi Megan, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Ask a Trainer. How are you today?
Hey Jess, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited about our conversation today.
Well, before we dive into our topic on transforming your training with effective practice, can you tell our viewers a little bit about you, how you got into L&D, and anything else you'd like to share?
Sure. I'd be happy to. So currently I'm working as a senior manager of learning and development, where I oversee a team of clinical data trainers. Prior to my present role, I worked as an instructional designer and then as a manager of instructional design. So a good deal of my experience really lies in developing, engaging curriculum that, hopefully really generates the behavior change that, we're looking for in our training. I will say I am a teacher by trade. So, started early on in my career as a teacher, and from there, developed some teachers, did a lot of professional development, and really felt my calling was, to develop training for, adults in the corporate setting. So transitioned over to, the corporate work that I'm doing today, and the rest is history. Yeah, and on a personal note, I reside in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've got two little boys who are very busy, and they keep me busy. So, when I'm not chasing them around, I am, obviously working and learning. And in my spare time, I really enjoy reading. So I'm kind of a nerd and love nonfiction books, and in fact, read a lot about learning. So it's probably not too exciting, but for me it is. So
Great. Yeah, I love a good nonfiction book. I'm in the middle of several myself, so trying to
get your recommendations later.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Great. Well, Megan, so you wrote this fantastic article on incorporating effective practice into our training. And I thought it was really neat how you talked about approaching training much in the same way that athletes get better on the field, through practice. So why do you think that's important?
Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of organizations are really seeing the benefit of learning and development. I think, we're kind of seeing L&D have a moment, a decade, whatever you want to call it. I see organizations investing in learning and development from, an upskilling and retention standpoint. I see them investing in learning and development from a recruiting standpoint, recruiting really great talent through learning and development. And I think a lot of organizations are realizing the benefit of learning and development. And that's great for L&D professionals like us. I think as a result, L&D professionals really have to take the opportunity here to think about our training in a way that's going to make the most difference for the employees who are taking the training. And I think what I mean by that is we need to think about how we're training people, and are we training them to get the behavior change that we're looking for, so that we can see that return on investment from an L&D perspective. So when I wrote the article, I think what really sparked my kind of idea was thinking through, sports, and when we see someone playing, a professional sport, when you're learning to play a professional sport, or even a college sport, even if you're in high school, you're not sitting in a classroom with a PowerPoint. The coach is not going through the drills on a PowerPoint. Of course, you may have a visual every now and then. I'm sure they're going to use different tactics to explain how to make the play or how to improve your performance. That said, the only way that athletes are improving their performance is through practice. And so I liken learning and development to being able to improve your performance through practice. And so I believe that we have an opportunity as L&D professionals to really develop curriculum, develop learning programs that allow our employees to get out on the field and practice, as opposed to putting them in a classroom or putting them behind a computer screen and having them, watch a PowerPoint, or, we talk to them about what they're going to do. So I think that really is what kind of generated my, spark to write the article.
Is there an optimal amount of time that trainers should spend on practice so that their learners can retain and then apply the skills that they're learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of it's going to come down to the type of content that you're training on. Um, I think it's fair to say that there are going to be times where we just need to get people information. And maybe that's in the form of a communication, maybe that's not necessarily in the form of a training. Um, but I think when we're thinking more about functional processes, or tactical skills that we need to teach employees, when we think about the ideal amount of practice time in a training session, I'm looking at anywhere from 80 to 85%, of using that time to get learners in the mix, on the field, as the analogy I used earlier, but using that block of time for practice. And so I think it's also important to note that we're not just releasing folks into the wild to, do something on their own. When we think about the role of a trainer, I think this approach really requires the trainer to become a facilitator and a coach. And so we're allowing our learners to practice these skills in a safe setting because they have someone who's guiding them and coaching them and giving them feedback on their plays, providing them with the learning that they need in the moment to make any changes and course correct and, better retain what they're learning, better retain the skills. 85% probably feels very scary for some trainers. And I agree that there needs to be a shift in mindset. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about how we can capitalize on our time when we don't have a lot of it. But I would say the more, the better there.
Are there any lessons learned or any do's and don'ts that you've come across as you've implemented practice in your own training that you've done?
Yeah, another great question. Gosh, I mean, I think there's so many. There's a couple that stick out when it comes to, the topic that we're talking about now, especially when we think about the role of a trainer in an approach like this. I think one of the first things that come to mind, when we think about do's and don'ts is don't overthink it. I think oftentimes trainers, especially, are used to being the subject matter expert. They have so much wisdom and expertise that they want to impart on their trainees. And that's why they're in the role, to be quite honest. With that said, I think sometimes people are very hesitant to have learners jump into new scenarios because of fear that they don't have enough knowledge to do so. And so I think that we need to stop overthinking what our learners don't know. And I think we need to give them some tools that they can rely on as they are practicing, and just allow ourselves to dive in and let them practice, understanding that mistakes may be made and it's not going to be perfect the first few times. But that's why, again, we're here as kind of our, kind of the coach and the facilitator.
Yeah.
I think another do or don't that I have, as far as don't overthinking it, also assert yourself as more of the, guide on the side. We're all familiar with sage on the stage, guide on the side. In this scenario, and in these trainings with heavy practice situations, I think you really need to be more of a guide on the side where you're stepping back and you're allowing the learner to be the star by giving them those opportunities to practice the skills. And then you're kind of on the side, giving them the feedback, giving them the coaching. When they come to you, you're there. But it's less about you and it's less about your expertise and what you can feed them, via talking, and more about how you can facilitate an environment that allows them to get this strategic practice. And so I also think that making sure that we are thinking about the learner's workflow is probably the last do that I would add to this list. When we think about training and we think about time. I know we're going to talk a little bit later about kind of how do we capitalize on time, but I think that we really need to make sure that what we're training on is strategic and that it really kind of emulates the learner's workflow. So whatever skill, whatever behavior, whatever process we're training to, we need to think about how they're going to do it in their workflow. And then we need to create practice scenarios that really allow them to emulate what they would do in the flow of work, because then they're going to be able to retain it a lot easier, take it back to, whatever it is they're doing and apply it fairly quickly.
I'm curious because you said something about, being a guide, being a coach, and a facilitator. So I'm wondering if you have any tips or recommendations for when a learner may not be, how you can pull a learner in for when they may not be that excited about a particular practice activity.
Yeah. So I think here I really enjoy using social learning as an opportunity to get learners engaged. So I think there's obviously a variety of ways that we can do this. When we encourage and facilitate peer-to-peer learning, there's innately going to be another kind of hierarchy or sense of accountability. I don't want to let my partner down. Humans are naturally very relational. And so, even if it's forced, we're going to, we're going to want to have that relation or communication, right? Connect with a person. And so I would really recommend integrating some social learning theory into a training program or even into the moment if you're finding that a learner is a bit reluctant to practice. I think that that's always a helpful way to kind of pull people out of their shell, pair people up, but put some accountability factors in there. So, pair people up and then call on folks to debrief. Obviously, we know that there are some other strategies, cold calling. I know that some trainers use that just as an engagement to reinforce kind of attention and all of that good stuff. That can be helpful. And then, of course, I think a lot of it comes down to how, as a facilitator and a trainer, you're interacting with the folks that you're training. Kind of coming in, being humble, and letting folks know that this is a safe space. So creating that psychologically safe space for them to understand that, trial and error is acceptable in this scenario and in this situation. And that's why we're here. Training environments are here for a reason. And so I'm here to A, see you struggle, but B, help you succeed. And so creating that psychologically safe experience for the learner is a great way to, kind of pull in that reluctant learner.
So we know that often resources and time are limited. And now we've kind of been getting up to this question. And we know that there's a need for practice and training. Do you have tips for trainers to be able to effectively balance both?
Yeah. I think when we think about a trainer's reluctance maybe to release and let our trainees practice, one thing that often comes up is, but what if they don't know? Or I need more time because I'm worried they're not going to remember. Or this person learns a lot slower, so I need to make sure that I'm really catching them up, or whatever the issue may be. We've all seen it as a trainer, and I think that the issues are definitely realistic. But I think that again, it comes down to that mind shift. So while a learner still may need information to perform the task or the skill that we're training them to, we need to think differently about the vehicle in which we're giving them that information. So I think in a more traditional setting, a trainer may give them the information via a variety of PowerPoint slides. They would go through their presentation and then they would say, okay, have a great day. Or maybe if there's time left, like we can do a 10-minute role play and that'll be good. And then like you can go on your way because our hour is up. But I think instead we need to shift the way that we're giving information. And I may have written about this for ATD, but one of the great kind of, in my opinion, advances in L&D is the idea of just-in-time learning. And so the way that we would expect a learner to get information or learn how to do something new on the job when they're in the flow of work is through information finding or reviewing a job aid or doing something kind of independently on their own to get to the answer of something. And I think we need to embed that in our training as well. So when we think about the trainer becoming a facilitator in this situation, I also think about a facilitator of resources and a facilitator of materials. And so maybe we're going to spend less time, talking to them about this new process, and instead we're going to create some materials that they can leverage during the practice session to refer to help them learn this new process. And those materials are also going to suffice for them when they're on the floor and they're working or wherever, whatever they're doing in their day-to-day role. I believe this will also help when we think about a time-constrained environment, because you're spending less time, talking at them to train them on this skill, and instead you're giving them the meat and potatoes, what they need, right? So they need these resources that they can refer to independently, and then they need a space to practice. They need to be able to refer to these resources as they practice, and so we're kind of meeting all of those goals. And of course, that's if you are using, the traditional kind of in-person training or maybe even a virtual kind of live session. I also think that there's been so many advances when it comes to e-learning that we can really create kind of some scenario-based training in an asynchronous environment that, again, allows our learners to start practicing off the bat instead of giving them a very text-heavy e-learning, which in my opinion is the same as, talking to them about a PowerPoint. So yeah, I would say just really embrace the kind of just-in-time learning theory that, has, I would say, really come to fruition in the past few years and look at it that way.
Well, Megan, thank you so much for sharing all of your tips and your insight and your experience with us today. Really appreciate you joining us on this episode of Ask a Trainer.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. I had a great time.
Megan, if people want to keep up with you on social media or anywhere else, where can they find you?
Yeah, so I would say LinkedIn is probably the best place. You can find me at Megan E. Dillon on LinkedIn.
Thanks again, Megan.
Thank you so much, Jess.
All right, that's all our time for today. Thanks everyone for watching. And a huge thanks to Megan Dillon for joining us on today's episode of Ask a Trainer. If you want to stay connected with Megan Dillon, check out the show notes below. And if you want to know when our next episode of Ask a Trainer is going live, click on that subscribe button and hit that bell icon to receive notification for when our next episode is going live. I'm Jess Thompson with ATD.